much for the invitation to speak about one of my interests in embossed stationery for Tasmania 1883 to 1912. I'll cover it in 6 sections. The first, the official envelopes, which were the first embossed stationery items to be issued by Tasmania in 1883, and they ran out in 1901. In 1891, Tasmania introduced an embossed stamp to order. I get into trouble with postal stationery collectors because they like to say stamp to order, and we've always had a habit called it embossed stationery, but stamp to order I'll call it. They organised halfpenny, penny and twopenny dies to enable the public to bring their stationery in to be suitably embossed with the rates they required. They've been denigrated and they suffer a bit from the fact that the philatelists got stuck into this ability to go and have all sorts of interesting items embossed. But there's a very interesting side. The commercial use of the 3 dies is an interesting field in itself. The next section, section 4, covers the stamp to order for the public, and I've called it the collector's playground, which it really was. You could go into the post office and have all sorts of different combinations stamped. One of the main reasons why the post office introduced the halfpenny die particularly was that around 1889 they started to charge postage on newspapers. Up till then it had been free, so they needed halfpenny wrappers and penny wrappers for the use of the newspaper publishers. And I finish off with what for a long while were thought to be official wrappers, but I'm pretty sure they're not. They were more of the printed to private order wrappers. So the first envelopes in May 1872, the Minister for Lands and Works suggested to the Postmaster General that they follow the lead of Victoria and New South Wales, who'd issued stamped envelopes in 1869 and 1870 respectively. The idea was received favourably, but was pointed out that they would need to get dies from England to produce the embossed envelopes. The secretaries of the GPO in Sydney and Melbourne were both asked for samples. They were supplied, but the ministry went out of office in August 1873 and the idea lapsed. In 1882, after a long struggle, postcards were introduced, and they'd been very political in the argument against postcards being that they would lack privacy and they could be used for inflammatory remarks. But the envelopes eventually were introduced in 1882, and a requisition was sent to the colonial storekeeper. And it was on the 21st of March 1883, there was a notice placed, the public notice that informed the public that on Monday the 2nd, envelopes with twopenny embossing will be sold to the public in packets of 1 dozen for 2 and 3pence, or if required, 4 for 9pence. And then quite amusing for today anyway, that there was a strong complaint about the fact that people had to pay a farthing for an envelope, being the premium, which imagine that going on today. Now that in producing the die for the twopenny envelope, De La Rue produced on the left-hand side, you'll see an artist's essay prepared for the design of the die and the die proof for the twopenny die itself. The envelope in the middle, Jeff Kello will recognise it. It was a double embossing, and when I got it, I realised it probably proves how De La Rue produced the envelopes in the first place. That they were produced on a flat sheet of paper, embossed, and then cut and folded to make the envelope. Because in this instance, you can see on the left-hand side the reverse of the embossing, which is actually a proper embossing on the inside of the envelope. So in this case, there's been an error in production, and it's had 2 embossings placed on the outside, and the inside's got a proper, correct embossing. So to me, it proves that the envelopes were actually made separately in sheets of paper and folded after embossing.
Your presentation isn't coming across.
Anyone else got a problem?
Yes, I've just got the first page.
It's the first page. We're still on the first page.
I've got your title page.
I've just pressed the second page should have come across, not a bit. How about that?
No, it hasn't come across.
No.
Working on my screen, I don't know why.
No, it's not working on our screen, Malcolm.
Just stop sharing and share again, Malcolm. That will often fix it.
There it is.
There it is.
You got it? It's full screen's mucking it up, so I'll try and use...
We've got page 2 now.
Yeah, okay. Is that all right? Because you're seeing the rest of them from the desktop. That doesn't matter, does it?
No.
No, that's
Okay.
fine.
So I'll go back to start again. I'm sorry about that.
So,
The artist essay for the design of the tuppenny die is on the left-hand side, a hand-painted essay by De La Rue. And the die proof that was resulting from that die is shown below that. The envelope that I was talking about is in the middle with the embossing on the inside of the envelope and 2 further embossings on the outside. It proves to me that De La Rue produced the envelopes. They embossed sheets of paper and then cut them and folded them into envelopes after the embossing. And the right-hand side's this is a commonly seen envelope with the pointed flap and doesn't have any envelope manufacturer's name on the envelope. All the published records indicate that there were 200,000 of these envelopes produced, but in doing all my research, I've come to the conclusion that there are really only 100,000, not 200,000. And the reason being that when they were issued in March 1883, they were well received as being neat in appearance and almost tempting enough to make one write to friends in the other colonies. But in 1889, in answer to a question in the House of Assembly, when the question was asked were they going to produce 1 penny envelopes, and the Treasurer said that they had embossed had envelopes embossed with a tuppenny stamp, but there was little or no demand for them. So to me, it indicated, and using figures coming from the Tasmanian Parliament's annual reports, in green on the right-hand side, you can see the numbers of envelopes they reported as being issued from 1889 to 1900. I've done a table that shows that for the 100,000 to be used up by 1901, which you don't find them used after that date, the numbers they're quoting would only get rid of 100,000 envelopes in that time, not 200,000. And the reason the numbers start increasing in 1892, you can see that the numbers start to increase quite markedly. They started to report the embossed envelopes that they were doing for the publics in that time as well. So for around 5,000 envelopes a year through to 1900 gets rid of the 100,000 envelopes that they produced. And the other evidence that I think proves that there are only 100,000 is in the De La Rue archives. There's a note in around 1889 which detailed all the number of postcards and envelopes that had been produced by De La Rue, and there was only one entry saying 100,000, not 200,000. So to me, that sort of makes sense in terms of how many envelopes are known and the fact that after 1900 you don't find them. So the envelopes are known with specimen overprints. There's 5 recorded ones, and I found 2 unrecorded types, and I think they were basically used overprinted specimen for distribution to parliamentarians and to other UPU countries. I mentioned earlier that they were sold in packs of 1 dozen for 2 and 3pence. In the middle, there's a pack with the wrapper band that came with it, with the 12 envelopes that were in that pack. And on the right-hand side, you can see the earliest recorded, pretty sad-looking envelope, but it still represents the earliest recorded use on May the 21st, 1883. And below that, some of the interesting envelopes you'll find are the uprated envelopes sent overseas. And there's a group of them there, and Alan will recognise the one to Leipzig. We're still not absolutely convinced, and we know why it's got such a high postage on it. It is registered, but there may be some explanation. But on the right-hand side, you can see the uprated envelopes in 1884, uprated to 6pence for the long sea route to London. Below that, 1890, just before the UPU, the sixpenny rate to Belgium, and the 3 other envelopes represent the UPU rate after Tasmania joined the UPU in November 1891. There's a single rate, a rate from the Tasmanian mainline railway to USA.
Oh, there, you might have to put it in the microwave. No.
And the double rate down the left-hand side. In 1891, the Tasmanian Post Office announced that they were introducing a stamp-to-order service for the public to bring letter envelopes and postcards in to have embossed postage placed on them. And in order to do that, they wanted a halfpenny and a 1 penny die in addition to the 2 penny. And the 2 envelopes on the left are the essays from the Delaro archives showing how they went about ordering it. The 2 penny envelope used as an essay with the halfpenny added and the 1 penny below it. And the die proofs there are showing that the die and the punch were produced in January 1890 and the envelope dies sent out to the colony for use in Hobart. There's been some debate in the literature, and Ingalls in the chapter in the Tinsley book talks about the penny and the 2 penny envelopes being post office issues, but I'm convinced they're not. The fact that if they had an embossed to order service in the post office, I don't see why they would have also produced their own envelopes in competition. The halfpenny envelope could never have really been officially issued until 1911 because there wasn't a rate for it, and I don't believe the post office would have produced halfpenny envelopes when there was no rate for such a thing. The penny envelopes and the 2 penny envelopes, almost invariably the ones that are known used coming from Westbury, where there was a firm of solicitors, and they're either addressed to Miller and Miller solicitors in Launceston or the Registrar of Deeds. So to my way of thinking, that they were stamped to order envelopes produced by stationery sellers who produced the penny and the 2 penny particularly. And a lot of these 2 penny envelopes you'll see on the right, they're often found with company embossing on the flap. So to my way of thinking, I think they were purchased from stationers already stamped and had the additional markings placed on them. But as I said, they're almost always found from Westbury, addressed to solicitors or the Registrar of Deeds. As I mentioned, there's a public notice, a post office notice on the left there showing that advising that envelopes and newspaper wrappers are embossed with 2 penny, 1 penny and halfpenny stamps as required, but the envelopes and wrappers must be supplied. No charge is made for stamping. And in the centre there is what I consider as the first day of use of the penny embossing in particular. It was introduced on the Friday before this envelope was postmarked, and I quite believe that this envelope posted on the first day available was the following Monday, on January the 6th, 1891, addressed to Melbourne, was the first possible use of such an envelope. On the right-hand side, there's an earliest recorded use of the halfpenny on an envelope to Parry, and you'll find a lot of these envelopes addressed to dealers or in Germany or in Sydney, and whilst they sort of denigrated because they're philatelic mail, they still prove that these items were the earliest dates and when they came into use. And the 2 penny envelope down in the bottom right-hand corner, the penny and the halfpenny were first made available at the postal guides postal guide number 1 in 1891. Only was amended to state that only the penny and the halfpenny were available. It was later changed in 1894, the January 1894 postal guide announced that 2 pennies could also be embossed on envelopes. And this envelope in the bottom right-hand corner is actually dated June the 9th, 1893 to Germany. So that's probably most likely the earliest recorded date for a 2 penny embossing. Now, moving on to what I find is probably the most interesting part of the whole collection is the use by commercial enterprises in Tasmania of embossed stationery. On the left-hand side is probably the earliest recorded use of such embossing, a postal card. And the amusing thing to me is that it's a candidate sending out cards to people to request him to vote for him. And in this particular case, it's been refused by the addressee, which is probably the fate of a lot of these cards. But the Brighton election, Thomas Dillon was successfully elected in that seat, but was lost his seat a year later. You've probably seen the R. Miller soap on wrappers in the middle. They're sought after and very attractive. And two other users, Harry White was a mining agent and broker, and he had penny embossed envelopes prepared with his imprint on the left-hand corner. And Milsom was a similar, he was Secretary and Treasurer of the Commercial Travellers Association in Hobart. E.C. Mace was a well-known stockbroker in Hobart, and in the middle of the mining boom, you'll find a lot of these embossed envelopes being used to send out mining notices and call notices to shareholders. And Mace was obviously the manager of the Mount Black Proprietary Mining Company and also manager of the Silver Queen Prospecting Association. Brownell Brothers were a department store in the middle of Hobart who ended up being taken over by Mars, but they had quite a lot of stationery with it. They either had it pre-printed or they had rubber hand stamps applied. And the Bank of Van Diemen's Land is another well-known user. The bank went into liquidation on the 3rd of August 1891, but it was curious that they went broke because they had a lot of money tied up in the mining industry, mining prospectors. At the time they went into liquidation, they were still listed at £6 a share and were paying a dividend of 9%. But a lot of all the Van Diemen's Land Bank envelopes are mentioned in liquidation. And there's one at the top is particularly interesting. In January and February 1893, you'll find the penny dye was applied in green instead of red, which was an error of colour. And there's several more I'll show you as we go through. I mentioned Brownell Brothers. One of the well-known stamp to order items is the triple folded brochure advertising their half-yearly sale. And this is also an error of colour. It's the penny green used in January 1893 for these particular items. But it's an interesting item in itself. Further uses, the Hobart Coffee Palace is still not as a coffee palace, but the building still stands in the middle of Hobart. And they had envelopes produced, stamped to order with their crest on the flap, tuppeny on two types of paper and a penny on similar paper. The Alliance Assurance Company had several variations on their envelopes. The Grand Lodge of Tasmania in the Freemasons. There's a mourning item up in the top right-hand corner, and the Clipper was a topical journal, labour-orientated journal published from 1893 to 1909. Well known, you've probably seen the True Shot postal wrappers. They were known in 3 different coloured papers, and they were based on an American idea where advertisers paid for space on the wrappers. They fold out to quite a large piece of stationery, and they're known with the penny embossing on 3 different coloured papers. And they're the only 2 used examples I've seen, both used in around May 1891 for the one at top to New Zealand and another one to South Australia in 1894. Further uses, the Perpetual Trustees and Executive Agency is self-explanatory. They had stationery with their crest embossed on the flap, and also used stationery envelopes with a rubber hand stamp applied. National Mutual Life Association, I've seen penny and tuppenny envelopes unused, and the only example I've seen of a used example is the one below in the tuppenny. Burgess Brothers were grocers and wholesale liquor merchants, and they ended up being taken over by Cascade Brewery, but they had envelopes of a penny and a tuppence with their crest in red and blue. On the left-hand corners, I recently managed to acquire this item, which is really, I'm pleased to have. The Renison Bell Prospecting and Mining Company had envelopes printed in stamped to order, but this example is registered from Hobart to Launceston with the registration fee paid by the penny kangaroo. It's the only combination I've seen of Australian Commonwealth stamps with the Tasmanian embossed hand stamp, embossed imprint. Westwood was another mining manager, the Una Silver Mining Company. Further pre-printed envelopes for the Equitable Life Assurance Society of the United States, which has got a printed message on the inside. Law and Western Archers solicitors it's an imprinted envelope as well. And rubber hand stamps used by Robert Price and L. Sussman, which were traders in Hobart and Launceston. One of the most commonly found uses of the penny embossing were the savings bank packets of a whole variety of shapes and sizes. But though there was a regulation that allowed for the sending of savings bank books a penny per 4 ounces to the savings banks where depositors were sending them in to have their interest recorded or to make deposits. The banks obviously had their envelopes sent out with the pre-stamped, the stamp to order embossing, and you can find them coming the other direction where the depositors were sending them into the banks, but they obviously didn't have access to embossed envelopes, and all the ones that we know of have got stamps applied. But the Hobart Savings Bank and the Launceston Bank for Savings were the two main users of these envelopes. Local government were big users of the envelopes. The municipality of St Leonard's is recorded up there. The Westbury municipality, and I know of the municipality of Campbelltown is the one I haven't got. So there's an interesting use of the envelopes there by private users. Waverley Cottage. Waverley was a rural property outside Oatlands, belonged to the Premier of Tasmania, James Agnew, but that's not one of the few examples I've seen where the crest is appearing on the envelope. They obviously, the interesting thing being that you had, in order to get them embossed, you had to have, the order had to be 480 in one stamping, which is interesting whether they actually adhered to that, because 480 was quite a lot of envelopes for a private person to acquire. Mark will be interested in the one on the top right-hand corner, another era of colour in February 1893, the penny green used on a T.J. Kane and Co. envelope. It was an era of colour, but Kanes were wholesale merchandisers in Hobart. And the last one on the bottom right-hand corner, the Grange was an accommodation apartments in 5 miles south of Hobart, and I've seen 3 envelopes with their embossing on the flap in red and blue. It's an interesting tuppence halfpenny rate with registered to London. You may have seen this. This is a curiosity. No one's been able to come up with a clear answer as to how this came about. You'll see it's a 3-part postcard, folded postcard, embossed on both sides with a penny. Fish and Sheep Dip were American fertilizer company, but no one's been able to work out why or how, or the purpose of having embossings on both sides, unless it was a reply paid system. And I'm wondering whether the address of the person it was sent to was actually a wrapper band around the card itself. But it's no evidence of it being used. But you'll see on the right-hand side, on the illustrated side, an embossing of the penny, and the same on the opposite side. If most of you have got an interest in this stationery will have seen Webster envelopes. Websters were agricultural equipment and suppliers and wool brokers in Hobart and across the state. And they've produced a series of very attractive embossed envelopes. The three different ones there for McCormick. Planet Junior is a well-known one that you see coming up on occasions in auction, and another design for McCormick. Webster's are still operating, but now they're walnut growers and cotton growers in New South Wales. They also produced a wide range of commercial envelopes, window-faced, commercial papers only, and standard envelopes with a penny and twopenny embossing, and they've been found uprated to the USA as well. But the one of particular interest that I recently managed to find is down the bottom in the middle is got a halfpenny embossing in orange, and it's the first genuine commercial use of a halfpenny envelope that I've found. In fact, on the 1st of May, the halfpenny rate was introduced, circular rate was introduced, which required envelopes to be posted in batches of 20, and it had to be marked as such, and that's got the rubber hand stamp, 20 copies posted. It's the only example I've seen of halfpenny in orange paying the correct rate. One of the opposition rural merchants was Roberts & Co. They were wool brokers as well. They were using, from about 1912, started using embossing service on their envelopes, and a particularly nice postcard advertising Massey Harris in the centre, used the same way. It was advising of supplies available or supplies received. And Use Little's Dip was another advertising postcard used by Roberts & Co., obviously advising that consignments were on hand. There's 2 cards there showing the back and the front. Walsh's were a major printing and stationery firm in Tasmania, and they were using the embossed service to produce calling cards with their crest pre-printed, and you can see on the left one there advising that Mr. Jones was coming to attend Zeehan to take orders in 1901. Another firm of solicitors using the same sort of system, postcards to advise clients that they wanted to make an appointment or to give them a call. And on the right-hand side, Walsh has produced a set of very attractive postcards with scenes on them. There's a set of 12, and there's 3 there, and there's more on the next page, but I've never seen them used, and I'm not sure whether they were produced as a proof set or were just as samples. There are the remaining 9 of the cards with various scenes, all pretty much based on Beatty photographs and used by Walsh's on their postcards. I found variations of these postcards, but not this particular design. Now we get into the collector's playground. The status of the postal cards with the extra halfpenny on them was reported in Vinden's Philatelic Monthly, and they quoted that there's no such official recognition of these cards, and that they're obviously done without authority from headquarters. So there's been articles written claiming that they're official, but there's no record, obviously, that happened. And bear with me, I'll just move it across. In the Stamp Collector in 1891, I'll read it out. A philatelist recently visiting Tasmania, was struck by the extreme obligingness of the postal department there in the manner of creating varieties, with the widespread belief that nothing pleased the collectors as much as a new stamp. He noted a parcel of the current 1895 postcards with an additional halfpenny impressed upon them, which had been made to order for a continental firm and which were about to be posted separately in order to have been duly used. The cards referred to were for Paul Kittleton, and you'll find them to Adolph Bauer as well. And they were obviously made up to order. And I think the post office at that stage was glad to grab every revenue they could get their hands on. So if collectors were able to take in old postcards, you can see a Walsh's postcard with a penny and a halfpenny added, embossed. The 1882, the first postcard issued by Tasmania with additional embossing in different colours, upside down, and actually a proper used one. But they were obviously a gold mine for collectors. And I'll read something that appeared in the London Philatelist. A letter to the editor dated the 9th of June 1892, published in the London Philatelist, reflects the views of collectors at the time regarding the emissions from the stamp to order service. In part, it states, he wrote to the editor, enclosing a variety of envelopes which have made their appearance here today. They have been struck to the order of a collector who seems to have a mania for novelties. Although I have purchased a few of each value, I do not hold with the principle, as I think it is taking collecting to such a pitch that shortly there will be no limit to provisionals and novelties, whichever one can call them, as long as the post office people will execute any order. That is the number of each value I now enclose. I should be pleased to have your opinion on the subject. Well, the editor responded, we have similar copies from other correspondents, used and unused, and the dies have recently been noted applied to various kinds of stationery. Our opinion of them is summed up in the word rubbish. I think it might be a bit harsh, but I think that their reputation can be recovered by the use of commercial use, but they still make an interesting collecting field that you'll find them. You actually do find genuinely used examples through these items. But there's the 3 examples of the twopenny official envelope with an additional embossing placed, additional halfpenny in green and orange and in different positions. I'll run quickly through the embossings. There's halfpenny in single, you can find them on all sorts of different coloured envelopes and actually genuinely used, but in the case of the halfpenny needed to be uprated. The penny embossings appear in exactly the same sort of range of colours, different shapes and sized envelopes. And they actually managed, as all good collectors would, to have them embossed upside down in the left-hand corner if you get the post office to do it. The twopenny envelopes are similarly found on a range of colours. There's a selection of used envelopes. The penny rate was obviously a rate that could be used without uprating, but there's a selection there of ones that I consider are probably genuinely commercially used by private address writers and uprated to New Zealand and overseas. But in amongst those, you'll find, I try and avoid collecting them addressed to dealers because they obviously are probably philatelic. Then you get to the double embossings and you can get all sorts of permutations and combinations of 2 halfpennies in orange, 2 halfpennies in red, halfpenny and a penny together in different orders, 2 pennies in red on different coloured envelopes, but used examples are nice to find as well. Now up in the top left-hand corner is another error of colour in February 1893, and I think this is probably commercial use of an envelope properly embossed, and other uses too below it. They look genuine to me. Then the halfpenny plus a twopenny envelope, which is the ones you find most commonly used in that because they paid the overseas postage rate, and 3 good examples there to India, England, and two to England that look perfectly commercial envelopes to me and nice usage. Then we move on to the penny plus the twopenny combination in different orders and on different envelopes. Twopenny plus twopenny is not common, but because there was no rate that it really applied to, and it was probably getting a bit expensive for collectors to start spending fourpence for an envelope when they had to do 480 at a time. Then you get the combination of 3 embossings of 3 halfpennies, 2 halfpennies and a penny, halfpenny and 2 pennies, and then the 3, they're quite attractive on the right-hand corner, the 3 different dies in the 3 different colours. Then you get the 3 pennies and then the twopenny and 2 pennies, and an interesting usage down in the bottom left-hand corner of 2 pennies and a halfpenny posted in Queensland addressed to Russia, which is paying the right rate, and that stage that was legitimate to use interchangeability of state stamps in other states. I noticed this before I about to give the presentation. For some unknown reason, the envelope in the centre at the top's back to front, and I can't work out what I've done. But it is a nice usage of 2 twopennies and a penny to India. I apologise for the inverted image, but I'll work out what's going on with that when I finish. 2 more usages of the three uses of the triple embossings to USA, England and Sussex, all paying the correct rate. Then you move on to oddities on the left-hand side, where the twopenny official envelopes had an extra halfpenny in orange and a halfpenny in green added, and cutouts used, which was legitimate until 1902, when it was prohibited from using cutouts from other envelopes on mail. We then get 4 quadruple embossings of 4 halfpennies, 2 halfpennies and 2 pennies, and 2 halfpennies and 2 pennies in a different order. And finally, the five embossings in 2 different arrangements. And there are 3 recorded usages of the 5 embossings, which is the correct rate. It's 2 halfpenny to England, and there's two I know of to England, and 1 to actually sent to interstate, which is overpaying the rate. Now, I won't run through all the details of the postage, but from 1841 to about 1889, Tasmania had free postage on newspapers. And every time the post office spoke or mentioned the fact that they might impose a halfpenny postage rate, there was uproar amongst the newspaper editors who claimed it was a tax on knowledge, and they backed off the post office until 1889, when, because most of the other states were charging halfpenny for postage on newspapers after 7 days of publication, Tasmania eventually fell into line, which was when most of the newspaper wrappers that you find started to come into existence. There are only 2 publishers that I found that actually used the service, the Mercury and the Tasmanian Mail, which was a weekly version of the Mercury. But you'll find there 3 variations of the halfpenny embossing on newspaper wrappers, which would have paid, if you, I can make this presentation available so you can read the table on the left in more detail. But a halfpenny would have paid for a newspaper to go interstate or internally after 7 days of publication, which was probably the main use. The penny rate was also a rate used for bulk parcels, for newspapers interstate, and for overweight newspapers. And there's 3 examples of different style banners for the Mercury there. And then they moved to different sized long envelopes for the Mercury. Very hard to find dated copies, and the ones I have found are all used around 1912. So I presume they were using them before that, but you only find the dumb obliterate of cancelling them, and it's not without a date to give you an indication of when they started. I mentioned the Tasmanian Mail. There's a halfpenny embossing on one of their wrappers. Twopenny embossings are more common because I think they weighed more and are sent to interstate and overseas. And there's one nice one there to India, and the rest you'll find them addressed to all sorts of places, including British Borneo, Germany, British Borneo. And for some reason in 1912, they started to get adventurous with the colours. The twopenny green started to appear in brown. You can see 2 examples there, and down in the right-hand corner in lilac. And they obviously needed penny halfpenny rates, so you'll find double embossings used for that, and an unused threepenny rate in the top right-hand corner. And one of my favourite items, which I've recently managed to acquire, was that a parcel of newspapers, label obviously applied to that, which pays the £6 10 ounce to £7 parcel of papers sent to Sydney, or sent to Melbourne in this case, I'm sorry. Then we get to the biggest number of Walsh's also produced wrappers for their publications. And that's the one on the left, the largest multiple of embossings I've seen, with 6 pennies on it. I've never seen a used one, but Walsh's also produced halfpenny newspaper only wrappers. They had to be endorsed newspaper only to comply with the rate. And there's various uses there to internally and overseas. There's a wrapper on the left hand, another area of colour for the penny green, used in January 1893, which is endorsed printed matter only from MLK. It's a privately used wrapper. Halfpenny orange wrapper. Federal Philatelic was produced by Bassett Hull, and you'll find quite a few of these addressed to places all over the world with the penny embossing. and 3 examples of the halfpenny embossing, all addressed to one addressee in Hobart. A lot of these were considered to be post office issues, but there's no evidence to say that they were. And I think with the stamp to order service offered by the post office, it's very unlikely that they would have started issuing their own newspaper wrappers. The only ones that can be confirmed as official are the Edward VII wrappers that didn't appear till 1906. There's only 2. There's a halfpenny and a penny variation of those. And the rest of them, I believe, are all printed to private order. Halfpennies and pennies in different shapes, coloured papers. And there's one there, an albino version of the plain penny embossing. 3 examples of different, all the same style there, but Ingalls referred to these as coming from the Asher reference copies. And the numbers up in the left-hand corner comply with the Asher catalogue. So whether Asher arranged for them or they were sent to him as being official, I'm not sure. Then there's the variation with the blue lines down either side, most likely produced by stationers in Tasmania. Then Tinsley wrote a long article about these particular wrappers and believed they were official, but once again, there's no evidence that they were ever sold or issued by the post office. He did a big study on the variation in the widths of the red lines, but there's 3 values known on different size wrappers and 4 usages there, 1 to a dealer, but the other 3, I think, are addressed to a legal person in London. It comes from a D. Allport, which is a firm of solicitors in Hobart. And finally, these are also attractive, but believed to be privately produced in all sorts of multitude of colours and embossings, as you can see. And I've only ever found 2 used examples of these used one to Hobart and 1 to South Australia. So that's it, gentlemen and ladies. Any questions? Thank you very much for listening.
Malcolm, we've got one question from Mark Zerio. He says, do you think the post office only required 480 impressions so that the user paid for 480 impressions, not 480 separate articles?
I think I've spoken to Mark about this, and I think it's right. I think it's 480 impressions. I think the post office were pretty pliable and amenable to doing anything that was requested of them. And to me, it's hard. You can interpret it to mean that they applied 480 impressions, because I can't believe, go back to that wrapper that had 6 impressions. I can't believe that someone would have gone in 6 times with 480 to get 480 of that item to have an additional impression put on. So to me, I think it's most likely that they took them in and they applied 480 impressions on. And I don't think there's anything that makes it clear whether they all had to be the same piece of stationery either. I think you could have taken in 50 green envelopes, 50 blue envelopes, 50 large envelopes or whatever, and get the post office to apply the embossing for you. But I think
Mark also says this might explain the multiple embossings found, which you just explained. And interestingly, you noticed stated that there was no stamping fee.
That's right. There was nothing. There was the aim of the post office was to gather the revenue, and I think, like the scarcity of some of those items, there's only one on 3 or 4 known copies of the 5 embossings, and if they'd had to do them in batches of 480 and they were for collectors, you'd imagine that more than 3 or 4 would be kicking around in people's collections nowadays. If they were commercial, you can understand why they're scarce, but if they're being done by collectors and getting 5 embossings placed on 1 envelope, and they had to do 480 at a time, there'd be more known to exist.
Any other questions? Gee, you must have done a really good job, Malcolm.
Probably not enough, that's the time.
Yeah, one from Brian Peace.
Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting that about 50 years earlier, the Sydney Post Office allowed you to take your stationery in and get it embossed. So probably that was the first time embossing was allowed by the post office. It was intended to raise a lot of money, but in effect it didn't.
Thanks, Brian. Yes, I did in my notes have mentioned that 1838 the Sydney Post Office were for the pioneers in that service, because the British Post Office were a few years later, weren't they, in the 1870s before they.
That's right.
Any other questions? All right, John, do you want to take over now, John, for the rest of the meeting? Mr. Shawley?
I'd call on Alan Shatton to respond to what's been a beautiful display. So, Alan, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, John. We enjoy rare privileges as members of the Rpsv. We've just had a presentation by the foremost collector of Tasmanian postal stationery in the world. Malcolm has a global reputation in philately, as I'm sure you know, and his various collections have been and are unsurpassed, and this one was no exception. The work that he's done to put together the die proofs is exceptional and it's unique. He has done a great deal of research into the quantities produced, and his conclusions, I think, are probably it's the first time that they've been presented, and they make a great deal of sense. And what was produced by the post office as opposed to produced by the stamping, I think is also conclusions of Malcolm's which are well backed up. Collecting embossed Tasmanian stationery is a real challenge. You can pick up 20 or 30 items fairly easily. Then it starts to get harder. Postally used items are difficult to find. It is seriously difficult to find postally used items that were not for philatelic purposes going to German or Sydney dealers. And probably 95% of the postally used items were sent to German stamp dealers. So Malcolm said that he wanted to focus on used examples, but there's not that many to focus on. And that is an outstanding collection of commercial usages. I'd just like to tell you something that Bassett Hole said about these stamp to order postcards, wrappers and envelopes. This is from the London Philatelist. Mr. Bassett Hole sends us some of the private issues. We have been informed that of these, many charming varieties are being offered for sale in various countries. Mr. Bassett Hole states that the Tasmanian authorities do not intend to have any more of this trash printed. It is a pity they didn't take this resolution earlier. That's what Bassett Hole thought about them. Tinsley didn't think anything very much better, but they're a fascinating field for collecting. The regulation stated, as Malcolm said, that you had to have 480 envelopes for any given stamping. That should mean that exotic combinations, there should be quite a lot of them, but there aren't. And what happened to all is a mystery, like a number of other items of Tasmanian postal stationery. I just thought I'd throw in that Malcolm and I are filing a catalogue of Tasmanian postal stationery. And I can assure you that copies signed by both the authors will command a premium and will prove to be an excellent investment. So watch this space. Malcolm, that was an absolutely outstanding presentation. I think it's unique. And I'd like the members of the Society to join me in thanking you in the usual way.
Alan, thank you very much indeed for that. The only thing I'd like to add is, Malcolm, the very first slide, I just thought the embossed image on your first sheet was just beautiful. It looked dramatic, and I thought it was a very, very attractive way to introduce your display. So thank you again, and thank you, Alan, for the vote of thanks. Any other questions prompted by that? Because I'm sure we're going well for time. So any other questions before we move on to more mundane matters like matters arising and the like?
John, can I just add something to what Alan said? Thanks very much for his kind words, but you don't have to, when the book gets published, you don't have to buy them in batches of 480. You can buy one at a time.
Question from Brian Pease regarding the 480. Did the Tasmanian Post Office discount for quantity as the Sydney Post Office did in 1841?
No, I think, Brian, they were 480 without a fee. But I think at some stage later in the period, when the Commonwealth took over, they started charging per 1,000. There wasn't. Sorry, there was a phone call.
No discount then?
No discount, but a fee. A fee about 1902, 1903, I think they started charging a fee. Might be later, but I think the Commonwealth Post Office took over and started to put it on a more commercial basis.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got all the questions, I believe. So
can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course you may. Absolutely.
Sorry.
Sorry.
That's all right, Malcolm. You answer your call and then we'll...
No, sorry. Sorry.
That's all right. Bearing in mind the numbers that had to be printed for these, I was quite surprised that there was only a single used item with 20 posted on. 20 posted, or as they had in Victoria, 100 posted, is something I'm very interested in. Was that because it was only introduced very late in Tasmania? Or, it just seems to be that if you're printing a large number, you would expect them to be more bulk posting.
I think, Ian, the real issue is that they were rare survivors, that they weren't the sort of things that didn't have a stamp as such on them. And so if they either had the stamp soaked off or they were in the rubbish, and the nature is a bit like you getting a bill in the mail. You rarely kept the envelope if it didn't have a stamp on it.
Yeah, well, trash mail, basically, yeah.
And there was really only from May 1911 to January 1913 was the only period where, before the kangaroo stamp came out, where it was possible to get them.
What, the 20 posted?
No, the halfpenny, the Tasmanian halfpenny.
Sorry.
I've seen a few 20 posted around from various places, but not with the halfpenny embossed. I know of one that's got halfpenny embossing in green, but I'm not telling you where that is at the moment because I want to acquire it.
You've got to watch this, Alan. We'll be into that.
Malcolm, wasn't there a UPU rate of a halfpenny for printed matter rate came in earlier in Tasmania, or did Tasmania not recognise it?
No, I don't think Tasmania. I think the only time you could, apart from a newspaper, the only time you could send anything for a halfpenny was when that printed papers rate came in 1911.
Okay.
I don't think Tasmania didn't recognise anything else that I'm aware of. Newspapers they did, but that was it.
I think we seem to have got through all of the questions, so thank you for responding to them, Malcolm. Right, we just got really some admin matters. We've got a new membership application from Richard. No, if he were listening, I don't know, Uglow, U-G-L-O-W. So I don't quite know how to pronounce that. And that's on the board, but that's quite useless when we're having a Zoom session to anyone who's watching. Announcements, the key thing is that the entries for the annual competition are due on the 20th of May. And bearing in mind, we've got a number of people from around the world, let me just doubly stress, which we put in the email, that scanned versions of exhibits are extremely welcome. So please, 20th of May, that's not long off. Okay, we'll then go on to the, what, has anyone got any general business? Sorry, before we move on. I'm welcomed by silence. Future meetings, day meeting on the 4th of May, that's Tuesday of next week. Kevin Keese, the Stamp Advisory Committee process. Malcolm, it's a pity you can't come over for that because I think you're on it, aren't you?
What's that, John?
I think you're on the Stamp Advisory Committee, aren't you?
Yeah, we're doing it online at the moment.
Yeah, well, Kevin Keast is giving a talk about its operation on Tuesday, but that is not a Zoom session, unfortunately. But you better get on that flight and come over and set him straight.
Heckle from the back of the room.
Yeah, you better come over and stay over for the 12th of May, because the subject for the Postal History Group is alcohol, and covers that relate to alcohol. Now, there's quite a few from Tasmania. We've tried to make sure Gary Diffin does not appear on this, because otherwise he's got more alcohol covers than you can throw a stick at. Philatelic meeting on the 20th of May, Tony Lyon, New Zealand, Forces Mail, to and from the Pacific, 1940 to 1945. I'm sure that's going to be a very, very good exhibit. And the library afternoon, the 29th of May. So in closing, thank you all from around the world for participating. It's been very good to see people from the UK, Europe and the USA. And we've had a good I can't do a quick head count. I think it's been about 19 or 20. So that's always
22
a good.
all up.
22
all up, that was good.
That's good to hear. Anyway, thank you all for participating, and I hope you've enjoyed your evening, and look forward to seeing you. We're having 2 more Zoom sessions this year to give our overseas members a chance to participate. It's good to see 3 people, because that encourages us that we've done the right thing. So thank you, and hope you've enjoyed your evening or early morning or whatever part of the day you're at. Thank you again. And thank you, Frank, for doing the admin.
No worries. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers, Jack.
Bye.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Malcolm.
Thanks.